Because I liked competition vintage cars, racing vintage cars, I sort of went for the more extreme version of vintage watch collecting, which to me would be the dive watches. It was an exciting and dangerous pursuit, and the watch was a part of that.
Reza, we're so excited to have you here on Talking Watches.
Thank you for having me.
So you have a theme. We could say this is a theme, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And you love vintage Rolex dive watches.
Correct.
Very specific vintage Rolex dive watches.
Well, the more extreme versions of the Rolex dive watches.
Some would
yeah.
say the most extreme.
Yes.
But before we get to all that, I'd love to talk a little bit about how you got into watches in the first place. So what was your first watch?
My first watch was actually this one right here. It's an Oyster date that my late father bought for me when I was 13.
When you were 13?
Yeah. And in those days, I mean, this was the aspirational watch. And it stayed with me ever since. I mean, I've had it from new and it still resides with me.
And do you wear it very often?
I did, until I became too big to wear it, actually. The size is too small.
Sure. And then you quickly jumped from this gift from your father into a very specific, very niche area of collecting, and that's intense Rolex dive watches.
Because I liked competition vintage cars, racing vintage cars, I sort of went for the more extreme version of vintage watch collecting.
Sure.
Which to me would be the dive watches.
What was your first dive watch?
My first dive watch was just a regular Submariner. Then I kind of started to specialize, and the reason for that was this guy, the Deep Sea Special.
You can't not notice it on this table or anywhere. This is a Deep Sea Special, and it's number
one.
Number one.
Yeah.
So the very first experimental dive watch
Yes.
from Rolex. And what year was this made?
1953.
So that's the same year that Submariner came out.
Yes, except that Rolex had brought a nuclear weapon to a gunfight. You know what I'm saying? It's a very different proposition to just the normal dive watch. And the question that comes up about this watch when people know that I own it, they say, is it wearable? And I say, well, of course it's wearable. A submarine wore it. So it's definitely wearable. But it's kind of a moot question, because it's kind of like asking, is the 300 SLR that Stirling Moss won the 1955 Mille Miglia, is it a drivable car? Yes, it's drivable, but you don't want to go do grocery shopping, right? Same thing with this.
This is among the most important dive watches, period. And again, you said that this was like bringing a nuclear bomb to a gunfight. I mean, this is really amazing. And the fact that, I guess I didn't really understand that this came out in 1953, the same year that 6204, 6205, all the earliest thin case subs came out. And they chose to withhold all this technology from most of their watches for a long time.
Yeah, but it's not necessary. The deepest they needed to go at the time, or could go, was they did it with a 6200 with a big crown, and that was pretty much enough depth rating for them.
This is number one. Which watch went to the bottom of the Mariana Trench?
Well, we think it's number 3 because it's in the Smithsonian. There's a letter with it pretty much confirming it. Number 3 and number 5 were modified. This is the only one in this specification with the low dome crystal. The other ones have the high dome glass on them.
Considerably higher.
Considerably higher, indeed. It's quite an object.
You can say that. So do you wear this around town?
I've worn it.
Yeah?
I've worn it. It's interesting.
Can I try it on?
Absolutely. You know you want to. Of course.
I mean, look at that thing. I love that it has a two-tone bracelet, two-tone stretch bracelet on it.
Exactly. It's I think it's designed to make it look a little more approachable. Let's put it this way.
So where does one go about acquiring the very first prototype Rolex Deep Sea Special?
It was by accident. I was walking by Christie's in New York, and I spotted a picture of this watch in their window, and I can't remember whether I actually hovered or moonwalked backwards to the window and said, I cannot believe this has come up.
Right.
And I just had to have it.
And what year was that?
That's 2005.
And if you don't mind me asking, what was roughly the cost of something like this back then?
It was the world record price for Rolex, and I think it was 300 and something thousand Swiss francs.
Which is amazing to think about, because in those 15 years, that's the average cost of an Oyster Paul Newman now.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
So let's go through a few of these here. So what is this guy right here?
Well, this is the single red Sea Dweller, which is the first of the dials that they did with a patent pending back. You see here we have 4 patent pendings of all the dial variations. And it's interesting because you see how the dial progressed into the production dial. It goes from the single red to the double red Mark 0 dial. They put the double red, some people say, because this looked too much like a 1680 red.
Interesting.
But I think maybe there's a technical reason, because with another line of red, it gained another 110 meters in depth. It went from 500 meters to 610. So
And that's meaningful.
That's meaningful. Another line of red and another 110 meters.
Sure.
And then the double pink dial, which is the one associated most with the patent pending. And then the Mark II dial, which was the production dial,
Right.
but still with a patent pending back. So they actually settled for this and put it into production.
What are some of the strangest COMEXs or some of the most interesting stories from the COMEX connection?
Well, this watch represents the golden era of diving. This is the watch that John McKenna took to 460 meters. It had the world record, of course, at the time. The watch is pretty beat up because it was never restored.
I love the inscription on the back.
Yeah.
And it's so light, so faint, you know?
Well, the guy wore it until I took it off him. I've been pursuing these kind of watches. I wanted a record watch. So to find one untouched was fantastic.
And so this is also the prototypical COMEX style right here.
It is. It's the 5513. And funny enough, I choose this one over the 5514 because the 5513 was such an enigmatic reference number. The first COMEX logo dials were 5513s. The first sword-handed military submariners were 5513s. And of course, James Bond had a 5513 and it had a magnet function on it, and he took the zip off that lady's dress. So it's a very useful watch as well.
And the 5513 is still a benchmark of early collecting. And you mentioned sword hands earlier.
Yeah.
So we're talking military watches.
Yes.
And I see a watch here that looks like your kind of run-of-the-mill 5513 mil sub, which is a super special watch, obviously. But this one is even more special.
It is indeed. It's the only one we know of, and we have papers for it, that was issued to the Iranian army in 1971. And it was quite an anomaly at the time when I bought it. I thought, why did the Iranian army get it? And of course, with a bit of research, one can actually place this watch. The Marine Special Forces were trained by the SBS, who this watch was essentially created for during the Shah's reign. And in 1973, Sultan Qaboos had inherited the communist Marxist uprising, invited the Iranian army in to help him fight this threat. And so the Iranian army invaded in 1973. This watch was issued in 1974. The insurgency was defeated in 75. So it puts it bang in the middle, where the British and the Iranian forces were fighting on the same side against a common enemy and managed to defeat them. And if the communists had won, there'd be no watch collectors.
That's very true.
Think about it.
And so this is the only known Iranian.
It's the only known one.
And so most of the watches that we have here on the table, or at least a good chunk, are vintage watches. You know, we'd say plastic crystals and matte dials, etc. And then we have this, which is neither of those things.
Yes, the Somazzatore, which is a curious watch made for the 50th anniversary of the Italian police divers. The first Rolex dive watch, the first Rolex military watch, was commissioned in 1935 by Panerai and delivered in 1936. So there's a direct lineage between that country and Rolex. And of course, the Italians love collecting Rolexes. I mean, if there's anyone who started this whole thing,
I'll say
probably the Italians.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting watch in that sense.
Yeah, and you wear these watches all the time?
Almost never.
Almost never. What do you wear most days?
I actually wear the Mil Sub. I mean, not all of them. I mean, they get wrist time.
What is it about the Mil Sub that does it?
I just love it. It's their Porsche 911, basically. They keep changing it and changing it and changing it, and it's the same design. And the simpler and lighter and more classic the watch, the more I gravitate towards it.
It feels like this is almost an academic pursuit for you. I mean, it's something to really explore Rolex's history, you know, the history of dive watches. And you've actually produced a book with Daniel Bourne and John Goldberg.
Yes.
I don't think many people know this, but that book is your collection.
It is my collection.
Every watch in there.
Yes, pretty much.
And what was the goal with the book? Just to document all
Just
these?
to document, 20-something years of work, and also the fact that I don't think you will get all these watches together again with all the reference numbers, all the dial types, etc., etc.
I think I already know the answer because you have that sitting right there. Absolutely. But what is the holy grail Rolex dive watch? The one that you would just love to have? Is it number 3, the one that went down to the Mariana Trench?
You know, I don't like the dial on that one, to be honest.
That's a white dial.
The white dial one.
Right.
It's got a crummy dial. I love this thing because actually I prefer the non-domed glass. It looks just so much cooler. Of course, number 3 is the more historically important one, but then number 1 is the first one. So I would go for this guy.
So you're content.
So I'm happy.
Yeah.
Yes.